Only 5 minutes ago, Prince William and Princess Anne stepped forward together to deliver the exact announcement that Great Britain had desperately feared, but never expected to hear so suddenly. King Charles has suffered a severe, life-threatening cardiac crisis inside the private quarters of Windsor Castle, followed by dangerous cardiovascular complications that have forced his medical team to suspend every single sovereign duty indefinitely. William's voice remained clinically controlled, but Anne's expression did not. And when the prince reached the final sentence of the official statement, the room fell into a silence so absolute and heavy that even the mechanical ticking of the palace clocks seemed unbearably loud. Before we unpack the intense psychological reality of this national emergency and what it means for the immediate survival of the monarchy, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch right now so you never miss a single exclusive deep dive update. William stood inside the white drawing room at Windsor Castle, keeping both hands firmly pressed against the lectern as if anchoring himself against a physical storm, while Anne remained rigid beside him, holding a handkerchief she never once raised to her face. Their joint appearance confirmed to global observers that this crisis had instantly bypassed standard palace public relations and evolved into a critical national emergency. The prince explained that Charles had suffered an acute cardiac episode immediately following a high-stakes private briefing, collapsing without warning in his study and requiring emergency, life-saving intervention. Specialist physicians later discovered severe cardiovascular complications, leaving the king profoundly weakened and entirely unable to perform his constitutional duties, which include the essential task of approving state legislation and conducting confidential audiences with government officials. William paused heavily before pronouncing the words, "My father," exposing the raw, agonizing grief beneath his polished sovereign armor. Anne had faced immense internal pressure from palace courtiers to describe the crisis as a temporary indisposition, but the Princess Royal flatly rejected the softer terminology, insisting that sugarcoating the diagnosis would only feed dangerous global rumors and sanitize the brutal reality of what Charles had endured. Then came the clinical revelation that changed the trajectory of the monarchy forever. William confirmed through a documented medical dossier that the king had lost consciousness and remained completely unresponsive during several highly critical minutes. Though specialists successfully stabilized his heart rhythm, his recovery is now described as prolonged, highly volatile, and entirely uncertain. Charles remains confined to a secure medical suite under 24-hour observation. Yet, according to his physician's recorded account, when the king finally regained consciousness, he did not ask about unresolved state papers, upcoming ceremonies, or constitutional titles. His very first words were to ask whether William and Anne had been told. That single, quiet question exposed exactly whom he trusts when the grand illusions of pride and ancient protocol no longer matter. William eventually looked down at the official typed statement, pushed it aside, and spoke entirely from the heart, declaring that his father is fighting, but he can no longer carry this monumental burden alone. Anne turned toward him in that moment, and neither of them attempted to hide their mutual devastation. As the briefing room emptied, a senior private secretary was observed carrying the secure red dispatch box, the container reserved for highly classified government papers, directly toward William's private quarters instead of the king's. The movement was silent, but its institutional meaning was unmistakable. While the public struggled to absorb the shock of the king's collapse, a much deeper, highly charged family drama was unfolding behind guarded doors. A son, a sister, and a queen were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that Charles might never return to the throne in the same capacity. The public announcement belonged to the nation, but the raw terror belonged entirely to the family. Behind the formal stone walls of Windsor, Prince William was not preparing for his inevitable succession. He was trying to comprehend how rapidly his father's physical vitality had evaporated. Princess Anne was not analyzing royal protocol. She was remembering her brother quietly admitting just weeks earlier that he was profoundly, structurally exhausted. And Queen Camilla, sitting alone in the adjacent parlor beside an untouched cup of tea, was confronting a future she had never allowed herself to psychologically imagine. William entered a private sitting room and dismissed the waiting staff. He removed his cufflinks with unsteady fingers, placing them on the table as if even their small weight had become an unbearable burden. He had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, but the process of succession felt entirely different when it was initiated by his father's acute physical suffering. Every decision he made now carried immense geopolitical danger. Moving too slowly to assume control could project weakness to the Commonwealth, while moving too quickly could make him appear eager to replace his ailing father. Anne carried her own distinct psychological weight. She knew her brother's stubborn habits, his deep-seated pride, and the calculated way he used grand ceremonies to mask his deteriorating health. She had challenged his relentless schedule before, but she now blamed herself for not pushing past his defenses. Through a documented private conversation with William, she disclosed that Charles had been suffering from acute breathlessness, sudden dizziness, and crushing chest pressure for weeks. The king had dismissed every single physiological warning sign as simple fatigue, even laughing when she begged him to rest. Now, that stubborn laughter haunted her. Camilla felt the institutional shift immediately. While the Queen remained physically close to her husband's bedside, the medical team systematically directed every critical diagnostic discussion toward William and Anne. When a senior cardiologist requested to speak privately with the King's immediate blood relatives, Camilla was forced to watch the door close, leaving her on the outside of the decision-making circle. The moment cut far deeper than any written protocol. She was his wife. Yet suddenly, she stood outside the true boundary of authority, watching others decide what came next. 2. Later that evening, Princess Catherine found William staring blankly at a framed photograph of Charles standing beside a young Prince George. Sitting quietly beside her husband, she waited until he finally spoke. William admitted that while he could easily manage the complex machinery of the crown, the daily system of approvals, red boxes, and state meetings, what he could not psychologically manage was telling his own children that their grandfather might never recover. Catherine placed her hand over his and gently reminded him that honesty had to begin at home. Meanwhile, Camilla confronted Anne in the corridor, demanding to know why the Queen had not been positioned beside William during the national announcement. Anne answered with a quiet, devastating brutality, stating that the country required an image of institutional stability, not an exhibition of marital grief. That night, a medical specialist handed William a highly confidential history of the King's recent health. One specific date stopped the prince cold. It was the night of a recent investiture rehearsal, a formal ceremony practice that the palace press office had publicly labeled as entirely uneventful. The family had believed the King's collapse occurred in one sudden, unpredictable moment, but the medical file pointed backward to a night when Charles's body had warned everyone, and the palace hierarchy chose absolute silence. 3 weeks prior to his collapse, King Charles stood inside St. George's Hall rehearsing the ceremony. Halfway through the procession, his right hand suddenly tightened around the back of a nearby chair, his face losing all color. For 11 agonizing seconds, he could not form words or answer when Princess Anne frantically called his name. The rehearsal was instantly halted, the grand doors were locked, and every single witness was strictly instructed by palace officials to describe the incident as a minor scheduling delay. That was the exact moment the true crisis had begun. Anne had reached Charles before anyone else, catching his arm as he struggled to find breath, and ordered the rehearsal terminated. An investiture is a highly public ceremony where the monarch presents honors, and cancelling one without a valid reason would have triggered immediate national panic. The king stubbornly refused an ambulance, but his sister threatened to shut down the entire upcoming state event unless he agreed to a private medical evaluation on site. He finally capitulated. Charles listened as a palace physician recommended immediate bed rest and urgent cardiac diagnostics. The king nodded, signed a document agreeing to a reduced schedule, and promised to follow the medical directives. Yet, within 48 hours, he began quietly instructing his staff to place official meetings back onto his calendar, believing that stepping back would project weakness. Anne believed he was actively gambling with his life. Their subsequent argument occurred without any aides present. Princess Anne told her brother that his legendary courage had devolved into absolute recklessness. Charles fired back that the monarchy could not pause simply because its sovereign felt fatigued. Anne struck the chair beside her, declaring that his duty to the crown did not give him the right to force his family to watch a completely preventable tragedy unfold. Charles turned away, unable to deny the diagnostic reality. William discovered this entire cover-up through the confidential file. The prince learned that the incident had been entirely erased from the general royal briefing notes, the daily intelligence summaries used to keep the senior family informed. His father had personally ordered his staff not to alarm the heir during a demanding constitutional period. Instead of feeling protected, the son felt deeply betrayed by his father's secrecy. Then, another documented warning emerged from the file. A written statement from a personal footman revealed that Charles had become severely dizzy after a private dinner, stabilizing himself against a stone corridor wall to prevent a fall. The king dismissed the servant's concern and ordered that no incident report be circulated. Camilla had known about this episode. She had initially urged him to seek rest, but she ultimately supported his demand for secrecy. William now saw her compliance as part of the danger, while Anne viewed it as definitive proof that fear of public scrutiny had completely overruled basic human judgment. Alone in the king's study, William opened the royal engagement diary and found cancelled medical appointments systematically replaced by official meetings. When he demanded to know who had authorized these dangerous alterations, the private secretary offered a quiet, single-word answer: the king. William carried the medical dossier directly toward his father's private suite, with Anne joining him at the door. For weeks, Charles had used his sovereign authority to protect his dangerous secret. Now, his son and his sister were about to use a mixture of love, anger, and constitutional necessity to strip that secret away forever. Charles was awake when they entered, but he immediately understood that this was not a comforting family visit. His son carried the heavy medical file, while his sister closed the door behind them and dismissed the waiting medical aides. For the first time since the crisis began, there were no courtiers, no doctors, and no carefully polished statements between the three of them. William placed the file on the bed and asked his father why he decided his own children had no right to know the truth. Charles looked exhausted, but his lifelong instinct to control the room remained intact, demanding to know how the confidential file had left the medical office. The king insisted the crisis was under control, but William did not back down. He explained that government briefings, diplomatic correspondence, and state authorizations were already being routed to Kensington Palace. He could not protect the survival of the institution, while being systematically denied the truth about the man at its absolute center.